Hi everyone, it's Rod Ellison, and I wanted to share a technique that I use when building worlds that incorporate a platform that moves throughout the world that your users can stand on. There's a set of steps required to make sure that the visible mesh and its collision object that will act as the platform that the users stand on stay in sync when you actually go to export your world. Basically, you need four objects to make a moving platform. You're going to need the visible mesh, you're going to need the collider, or the collision object that really matches that visible mesh. You're going to need some form of a path or a curve that the mesh will move around on, and you need a trigger object to play the resulting animation that actually moves the platform in the world in a loop. So here's the steps I use to get this thing going. The first thing I do is I hit Shift C. And if you notice, what that does is that moves the cursor, the 3D cursor, to the origin. So you'll see in your 3D cursor in your View tab, everything's at 0, 0, 0. I'm going to essentially get both of the visible and the collision objects reset at the origin point. And I do that by taking the object, like the visible mesh, and I'll go Object, Set Origin to the 3D cursor, and then I'll basically move the geometry to the origin. And I'll do the same for the collision object. Object, set origin to 3D cursor. Object, set origin, geometry to origin. So both of them are essentially aligned now at the origin. You may need to tweak where the collision object is based on how you would like it to be for your visible mesh. In this case, I need to bring the collision object up so that the standing part of it kind of matches up with my visible mesh. So I'll do G and then Z to bring it up so that you basically see the bottom of the mesh match up with the top of the visible mesh. And once I do that, I need to reset the collision object's origin to the cursor again, because the cursor is now technically below where the collision object is. Set object to origin. See how the green dot went down there. The next step is to animate the visible mesh so that it goes around the loop or the path that we've set up in the curve object. So the first thing we do is actually set the curve object, select it, and go to its data properties, and we need to make sure that the frames are set to correspond to the length of time that we want the visible mesh to move around. In my case, I like it to be a full 60 seconds. 1 minute is a full loop around this curve. And at 30 frames a second, 30 times 60 for 60 seconds is 1800. So I need to set my frames to 1800 on the curve itself. With my curve now set with the frames, I can select my moving transport, that's my visible mesh, and I'm going to add a constraint using the Constraints tab and say Follow Path, which is out here to the right. And I'm going to choose my Bezier circle, which is the curve object, and essentially it puts it at the 0 frame point. And at this point we can bake the animation of the visible object riding around this curve. We do that by going to Object, Animation, Bake Action, and you need to make sure that the end frame matches up with your number of frames, 1800 in my case. Frame step could be 1 or 2, essentially the number of frames for smooth motion, but you need to have visual keying, clear constraints, clear parents, and override current action selected. Hit OK. And we now have an animation under our moving transport. If we open our animation tab, we can actually see the action here in all of its keyframes. And as I pan and scroll, you can see the object actually floating along the curve all the way back to its starting point, 1800 frames. This will be our loop. The next step is to get our collision object matched up with our visible mesh, and we do that by clicking on the collision object and then holding Shift and then click on the visible mesh and go to your Item tab, and these are the coordinates of the visible mesh that we want the collision to match up with, and we can just right click and copy all to selected. And you'll see the collision object moved right to where it needed to over the visible mesh. And now comes a very important step that I often trip up on, but this is the step required. We need to parent the collision object underneath of the visible mesh. And I do so by coming over here and clicking the collision object, the cylinder, holding Control and hitting Moving Transport, which is the visible mesh. So these two items are now selected. And coming with your mouse back over the objects and hitting Control P and keep transform. With one final step, you need to click the child object that's now underneath the visible mesh and hitting Object, Apply All Transforms. This is a critical step. At this point, we can now bake the animation onto the collision object so that it matches our visible mesh on the moving transport. So we click the cylinder, which is our collision mesh. We go to Object, Animation, Bake Action, and the same settings as before. 1800 is my frames. Visual keying, clear constraints, clear parents, and override action. I hit OK. And you'll see that I now have the keyframes underneath of the collision object. It's this collision object's animation that's going to be the one we use when we run the world. So we actually don't need the moving transport, the visible mesh's animation. We can right click and actually clear its animation data, go back to the cylinder, and its animation data has one thing that we need to do first to make it work. We actually have to get rid of the bottom 6 lines, which are the rotation and the scale. If we don't remove those, then what happens at runtime is your visible mesh may end up being out of sync or off a few meters from your actual collision object. And next, what we'll do is we'll actually turn around the parent-child relationship. We'll select our moving transport, our visible mesh, hit Control and hit the cylinder, which is the collision mesh, so both are selected. Do Control P, keep transform, and now the visible mesh is a child of the collision object. And lastly, what we'll do is we'll give our collision animation a readable name, like Moving Transport Action, and go to our trigger object, which in nowhere is this big yellow object. Select the scene properties and scroll down, and in your Run on Start animation step, select the name Moving Transport Action. And we'll want this to be set up in a loop, and you could either have the transport moving forward or backward, that's up to you. And lastly, export your project. And finally, what you get, if we open this project up, is a moving platform that we can go out and jump on. And because the visible mesh is in sync with the collider mesh, there should be little jerking, provided you have enough keyframes. And that's it.